In the spring of 1873, a young woman named Beatrice navigated the intricate social maze of London, seeking to build a modest life in a city of endless chimney smoke and ceaseless ambition. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to Victorian London, where we will follow Beatrice through the careful routines of maintaining respectability in a boarding house near Bloomsbury. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Beatrice, 26 years old, with ink-stained fingers and chestnut hair pulled back in a simple knot, stood at the window of her third-floor room as morning light filtered through the lace curtains. The scent of coal fires drifted up from the street below, mingling with the aroma of bread baking in the boarding house kitchen. She pressed one palm against the cool glass, feeling the faint vibration of carriage wheels passing over cobblestones. Her room held the warmth of familiarity. The narrow bed with its worn quilt, the washstand with its chipped ceramic basin, the small writing desk where she spent her evenings, each object occupied its proper place. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet as she moved from the window, their sound as reliable as the church bells that marked the hours. By the time she had washed her face in the basin of cool water and arranged her hair, the boarding house had begun its daily stirring. Footsteps passed in the hallway outside her door, accompanied by the muted voices of other residents preparing for their own days. Mrs. Thornby, the landlady, could be heard directing the housemaid in the preparation of breakfast, her voice carrying up through the floorboards with maternal authority. Beatrice fastened the buttons of her gray wool dress, the fabric smooth beneath her fingertips. The dress was neither fashionable nor shabby, occupying that comfortable middle ground appropriate for a woman of modest means who worked as a copyist for a solicitor's firm. She had learned to move through the city without drawing undue attention, a skill as essential as literacy itself. The breakfast room welcomed her with the scent of porridge and tea. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating particles of dust that drifted lazily through the air. 3 other residents sat at the long table: Mr. Greaves, an elderly clerk; Miss Pemberton, a governess between situations; and young Mr. Walsh, who worked in some capacity at the Royal Exchange. She took her usual seat near the window. The porridge arrived in a plain ceramic bowl, its surface steaming gently. Mrs. Thornby poured tea from a brown earthenware pot, the liquid dark and fragrant. Beatrice added milk from a small pitcher, watching the cream swirl and blend, turning the tea to the color of autumn leaves. Conversation at the table remained pleasantly subdued. Mr. Greaves mentioned the weather, noting that the morning fog had lifted earlier than usual. Miss Pemberton inquired politely about a book Beatrice had been reading. The exchange of words required no particular thought, only the comfortable acknowledgement of shared space. When breakfast was complete, Beatrice returned to her room to collect her shawl and the leather satchel that contained her work materials. The walk to the solicitor's firm would take 30 minutes at an unhurried pace, and she preferred to arrive with time to settle herself before beginning the day's copying. Stepping onto the street, she felt the familiar texture of the city envelop her. The air carried the scent of horses, coal smoke, and the faint sweetness of flowers from a nearby vendor's cart. A lamplighter passed, his ladder balanced over one shoulder, though his work would not begin for hours yet. Two women in dark dresses walked arm in arm, their voices blending with the general murmur of morning activity. Beatrice, 26 years old, moved along the pavement with the measured grace that came from years of navigating these streets. She kept her gaze level, acknowledging acquaintances with a slight nod, but avoiding the directness that might invite unwanted conversation. Her ink-stained fingers held her satchel close, the weight of it reassuring against her side. The route took her past shops beginning to open for the day. A baker arranged loaves in his window, their crusts golden in the morning light. A milliner adjusted a display of bonnets, each one adorned with ribbons or modest feathers. The buildings leaned close together, their brick facades darkened by decades of smoke, windows reflecting the pale sky above. At the corner of Bedford Row, she paused to allow a delivery cart to pass. The horse pulling it moved with patient steadiness, its hooves striking the cobblestones in a rhythm that seemed to measure time itself. The driver touched his cap to her, a gesture she returned with a brief inclination of her head. The solicitor's firm occupied the ground floor of a Georgian building, its windows tall and narrow. Beatrice entered through the side door reserved for staff, stepping into the familiar dimness of the corridor. The scent of old paper and leather bindings greeted her, accompanied by the faint mustiness of documents stored in rooms that never quite lost their damp. Her workroom stood at the back of the building, a small space with a single window overlooking a courtyard. The desk waited with its usual complement of materials: paper, ink, blotting sand, and the stack of documents requiring transcription. She removed her shawl and hung it on the peg by the door, then arranged her supplies with the methodical care that defined her approach to all tasks. Settling into her chair, Beatrice dipped her pen and began the day's work. The first document concerned a property transfer in Hampstead, its language formal and precise. Her hand moved across the page with steady confidence, forming each letter with the clarity necessary for legal records. The scratch of the nib against paper became a meditation, a rhythm that carried her through the morning. Hours passed in this manner. Occasionally she paused to flex her fingers or to replenish her inkwell. Light shifted across her desk as the sun moved overhead, casting different patterns through the window. The sounds of the building formed a backdrop: footsteps in the corridor, voices in distant rooms, the creak of floorboards responding to weight and weather. By midday, her hand had grown pleasantly tired. She set down her pen and stretched her fingers, observing the slight tremor that came from sustained effort. The stack of completed documents had grown satisfyingly tall. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing down into the courtyard where a few pigeons pecked at the paving stones. The afternoon brought different work-copying correspondence from one of the senior partners to various clients. The letters required not only accurate transcription, but also attention to tone and formatting. Beatrice approached each one with patient concentration, her ink-stained fingers holding the pen with practiced ease. When the church bells rang 4 o'clock, she allowed herself a brief rest. Mrs. Thornby had packed her a small lunch bread with cheese wrapped in brown paper and an apple from the basket kept in the boarding house kitchen. She ate slowly, savoring the simple flavors, watching dust motes drift through the late afternoon light. The day's final hours passed in a state of quiet absorption. The last document involved a will, its language both formal and somehow intimate, disposing of a life's accumulated possessions with methodical precision. Beatrice copied each clause with particular care, aware that these words would outlast their author. By the time she finished, the light through the window had softened to the amber quality of early evening. She cleaned her pen, stoppered the inkwell, and arranged the completed documents in their proper folders. The room held the stillness that came with the day's conclusion, a peaceful exhaustion settling over desk and chair and window. Outside, the street had transformed into its evening character. Lamps were being lit, their glow beginning to punctuate the gathering dusk. Workers streamed from offices and shops, each person absorbed in their own trajectory through the city. Beatrice joined this flow, her shawl drawn close against the cooling air. The walk home retraced her morning route but felt different in the changing light. Shops were closing, their proprietors pulling shutters across windows or sweeping stoops one final time. The flower vendor had departed, leaving only the memory of sweetness in the air. A newspaper boy called out headlines, his voice joining the general chorus of evening sounds. At the boarding house, Mrs. Thornby was preparing the evening meal. The scent of roasted meat and vegetables drifted up through the building, announcing supper. Beatrice climbed the stairs to her room, her footsteps creating their familiar rhythm on the worn treads. She removed her shawl and smoothed her chestnut hair, noting how the day's work had left its mark in the tightness of her shoulders and the pleasant ache in her writing hand. The evening meal brought the residents together once more. They gathered around the long table, passing serving dishes and exchanging the day's minor observations. Mr. Greaves mentioned a change in omnibus schedules. Miss Pemberton shared news of a potential position in Kensington. The conversation flowed easily, requiring no great effort, simply the comfortable acknowledgement of shared existence. After supper, Beatrice returned to her room as twilight deepened into night. She lit the candle on her desk, its flame casting a warm circle of light. From her satchel, she removed a book borrowed from a lending library, a volume of essays on natural history, written in language both precise and somehow soothing. She settled into the chair by the window, the book open in her lap. Below, the street had grown quieter, the day's activity ebbing into the relative stillness of night. Occasional footsteps passed, and the distant rumble of carriages never quite ceased, but the urgent energy of daylight had transformed into something gentler. The words on the page described the migration patterns of birds, the way certain species return to familiar grounds year after year. Beatrice read slowly, letting each sentence settle before moving to the next. Her mind drifted occasionally, observing her own patterns: the daily walk, the copying work, the meals in the boarding house, and finding in them a kind of migration of their own. When the candle had burned down to half its length, she closed the book and prepared for bed. The room held the accumulated warmth of the day, and the familiar scent of coal fires drifted through the slightly opened window. She loosened her hair from its knot, brushing it with slow, measured strokes. Beneath the worn quilt, she felt her body begin to release the day's small tensions. The mattress had molded itself to her shape over months of use, offering the comfort of long acquaintance. Through the walls came the muted sounds of other residents settling for the night, the creak of bed frames, the soft closing of doors, the whisper of pages turning. Beatrice, 26 years old, lay in the darkness with her eyes open, observing the play of shadows on the ceiling. Her ink-stained fingers rested on the quilt, still holding the memory of the day's work. Tomorrow would bring more documents to copy, more walks through the city's familiar streets, more meals at the boarding house table. The church bells rang the hour 10 o'clock, their sound rolling across the rooftops and chimneys of London. She listened until the last echo faded, then closed her eyes. Sleep would come soon, she knew, arriving with the same reliable patience that marked all her days. Outside, the city continued its endless breathing carriages rolling over cobblestones, voices calling in distant streets, the soft settling of buildings into night. Inside, the boarding house held its small community of sleepers, each person tucked into their own narrow room, dreaming their own modest dreams. Beatrice's breathing slowed and deepened. Her body sank further into the mattress, muscles releasing their final tensions. The day dissolved into memory, making space for whatever tomorrow might bring. For now, there was only this moment-warm quilt, soft pillow, the gentle descent into rest. The candle on the desk had gone out, its smoke curling upward in the darkness. Through the window, a single star was visible between the buildings, its light steady and ancient. The sounds of the city grew more distant, fading into the general hum of night. In her room on the third floor of Mrs. Thornby's boarding house, Beatrice slept, her chestnut hair spread across the pillow, her ink-stained fingers relaxed and still. Around her, London settled into its own form of sleep, that partial rest a city never fully achieves. But here, in this small room, peace had arrived completely. The worn quilt rose and fell with her breathing. The floorboards held their stillness. The window glass reflected nothing but darkness. All was quiet, all was calm, all was exactly as it should be. The morning arrived with the same gentle insistence as always. Pale light crept across the floorboards of Beatrice's room, touching first the washstand, then the foot of the bed, finally reaching her face with its cool promise of a new day. She woke gradually, without urgency, her body rising toward consciousness the way smoke drifts upward from a banked fire. She remained still for several moments, listening to the building wake around her. Mrs. Thornby's voice floated up from below, directing the housemaid in some task. Water ran through pipes within the walls, marking the ablutions of other residents. A cart passed in the street outside, its wheels creating their familiar music against the cobblestones. Beatrice, 26 years old, pushed back the worn quilt and set her feet on the cool floorboards. The morning air held a crispness that spoke of autumn's approach, though summer had not yet fully released its hold. She moved to the washstand and poured water from the pitcher into the basin, the liquid catching the morning light as it fell. The water against her face brought full wakefulness. She patted her skin dry with a rough linen towel, then began the process of arranging her chestnut hair. Her fingers worked with practiced efficiency, sectioning and pinning, creating the simple knot she wore each day. The mirror above the washstand reflected her image, unremarkable, respectable, precisely as she intended. Her gray wool dress hung on its peg, freshly brushed the previous evening. She fastened each button with care, her ink-stained fingers moving in their accustomed pattern. The fabric settled around her shoulders with the comfort of long familiarity, neither tight nor loose, simply present. Descending the stairs, she trailed one hand along the banister, feeling the smoothness worn into the wood by countless hands before hers. The breakfast room held its usual occupants. Mr. Greaves already seated with his newspaper, Miss Pemberton writing a letter at the corner of the table, young Mr. Walsh consuming his porridge with the efficient speed of youth. The morning meal arrived in its reliable sequence. Porridge first, served in the plain ceramic bowl that had become as familiar as her own hand. Then toast, cut from bread baked in the basement kitchen, its surface crisp and golden. Mrs. Thornby poured tea with her customary precision, adding just the right amount to each cup. Beatrice spread butter across her toast, watching it melt into the warm surface. The taste was simple, unadorned, exactly what the morning required. Around her, quiet conversation ebbed and flowed, whether observations, mentions of appointments, the small currency of boarding house life exchanged without great investment. When breakfast concluded, she gathered her shawl and satchel, checking that she had everything needed for the day's work. The solicitor's firm expected her by 8:30, and she preferred to arrive with minutes to spare, allowing time to settle her materials before beginning. The street greeted her with its morning character. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, sending small clouds of dust into the air. A milkman made his rounds, glass bottles clinking in their carrier. Two clerks walked past deep in conversation, their voices earnest with some matter of business or gossip. Beatrice moved along the pavement with her usual measured pace. Her route took her through streets she knew intimately. Every crossing, every landmark, every shop window had long since become part of her internal map. She nodded to the woman who sold flowers on the corner, though she rarely purchased any, the gesture simply an acknowledgement of mutual existence. At the solicitor's firm, the day's work awaited in its customary stack. Documents requiring transcription, letters to be copied, the endless paper trail of legal matters requiring her careful attention. She removed her shawl, arranged her supplies, and settled into the rhythm that would carry her through until midday. The first document concerned a lease agreement for commercial premises in Clerkenwell. Her pen moved across the page, forming words that would bind one party to another in matters of rent and maintenance. The language was formulaic, yet each word mattered, each phrase carried weight. Hours dissolved into the steady scratch of pen on paper. Light shifted through her window as morning advanced toward noon. Her hand grew warm from sustained effort, the muscles between thumb and forefinger developing that pleasant ache that came from purposeful work. By midday, she had completed 7 documents. The stack of finished pages sat to her right, each one blotted and dried, ready for review by the senior partners. She stood and stretched, feeling her spine lengthen, her shoulders release their forward curve. The courtyard below her window held a few sparrows now, their small bodies hopping across the paving stones in search of crumbs or insects. She watched them for several minutes, observing their quick movements, their apparent purposefulness. They seemed to know exactly what they sought, even if she could not determine what that might be. Her lunch waited in the satchel, bread and cold meat today, wrapped in brown paper by Mrs. Thornby's capable hands. An apple accompanied it, slightly soft but still sweet. She ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, allowing the flavors to register fully before swallowing. The afternoon's work involved correspondence of a more delicate nature. A client in Brighton required explanation of complications in an estate settlement. Another client, a widow in Mayfair, needed reassurance about the progress of a property dispute. The senior partner's words had to be copied with particular attention to tone, preserving both firmness and compassion. Beatrice approached these letters with heightened concentration. Her ink-stained fingers held the pen lightly, allowing the words to flow without force. She paused occasionally to reread a passage, ensuring that her transcription captured not just the words but their intended effect. The church bells marked the hours, 1 o'clock, 2, 3. Each chime registered in her awareness without interrupting her focus. Time passed both slowly and quickly, the paradox of absorbed attention making hours feel like moments and moments like hours. By 4 o'clock, the light through her window had taken on its late afternoon quality, warmer and more golden than the clear light of morning. She completed the final letter, a response to an inquiry about boundary disputes, and set down her pen with a sense of completion. The ritual of day's end followed its established pattern. Pen cleaned and set aside, inkwell stoppered, completed documents arranged in proper order. She stood and moved to the window one last time, observing how shadows had lengthened across the courtyard, how the pigeons had returned to their roosts. Outside, the street had begun its transformation into evening. Workers emerged from doorways, their faces showing the fatigue that came with day's labor. Shops began their closing routines, proprietors tallying receipts or arranging displays for tomorrow. The light grew softer, more forgiving, casting everything in tones of amber and rose. Beatrice joined the homeward flow, her shawl drawn against the cooling air. The walk retraced her morning path but felt different now, the street revealing its evening face. A lamplighter had begun his rounds, touching flame to wicks, creating pools of illumination that would guide the city through darkness. At the boarding house, the familiar sense of supper preparation filled the stairwell. She climbed to her room, her footsteps creating their reliable rhythm. The space welcomed her with its accumulated warmth, the day's heat trapped between walls and ceiling. She hung her shawl and smoothed her chestnut hair, noting in the mirror how the day had left its mark in the slight redness around her eyes, the way her shoulders curved forward from hours at the desk. These were honest signs of work completed, nothing to trouble her. Supper brought the household together once more. The long table held its usual company, each person occupying their customary chair. The meal tonight was shepherd's pie, its surface browned and slightly crisp, steam rising when Mrs. Thornby cut into it with her serving spoon. Conversation circled through familiar topics. Mr. Greaves mentioned changes to the postal rates. Miss Pemberton shared news of a former employer who had written requesting a character reference. Young Mr. Walsh spoke enthusiastically about some matter at the exchange that Beatrice only partially followed. She contributed little to the talk, offering occasional observations but mostly content to listen. The voices around her created a comfortable murmur, requiring no great engagement, simply the presence of company after a day of solitary work. After supper, she climbed once more to her room. The evening stretched before her with its gentle possibilities. She lit the candle on her desk and retrieved the book of natural history essays, opening to where she had left off the previous night. The essay described the life cycle of certain moths, their transformation from caterpillar to chrysalis to winged creature. The author wrote with careful observation, noting details of coloring and behavior that revealed years of patient study. Beatrice read slowly, allowing each paragraph to settle before continuing. Outside her window, night deepened over London. The street below grew quieter, though never entirely silent. Voices called occasionally, and the rumble of late carriages continued, but the frantic energy of daylight had subsided into something more contemplative. She read until the candle burned low, then marked her place and set the book aside. The evening ritual of preparation for sleep unfolded in its accustomed sequence. Hair brushed and left loose, face washed one final time, nightdress pulled over her head. Beneath the worn quilt, she felt her body begin its nightly release. The mattress accepted her weight, the pillow cradled her head. Through the walls came the settling sounds of the boarding house, creaking wood, distant footsteps, the soft closing of a door somewhere below. Beatrice, 26 years old, lay watching shadows play across the ceiling. Her ink-stained fingers rested on the quilt, still and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring more documents, more careful copying, more walks through streets she knew as well as the lines on her own palm. The church bells rang 10 times, each note clear and resonant in the night air. She counted them silently, marking the hour without anxiety. Sleep would arrive in its own time, and she was content to wait, suspended in that peaceful space between waking and dreams. The next morning brought clouds, their undersides heavy with the promise of rain that might or might not arrive. Beatrice woke to light that seemed filtered through gray wool, softer and more diffused than the clear brightness of previous days. She lay still for a moment, listening to the altered quality of sound that came with overcast skies, everything slightly muted, as though the city itself spoke in hushed tones. Rising from bed, she moved through her morning preparations with the same careful attention as always. The water in the basin felt cooler today, bringing alertness with its touch against her skin. She worked her chestnut hair into its customary knot, her fingers moving through the familiar sequence of gathering and pinning. Her gray wool dress seemed particularly appropriate for the day's subdued light. The fabric held warmth without weight, a quality she appreciated as she fastened the buttons. From the street below came the sound of cart wheels and voices, the city beginning its daily rhythms regardless of weather. In the breakfast room, Mrs. Thornby had set out the usual morning offerings. Porridge steamed in its serving bowl, accompanied by a plate of bread already sliced and arranged. The teapot sat in its quilted cozy, maintaining its heat. Beatrice took her place at the table, exchanging quiet greetings with Mr. Greaves and Miss Pemberton. The porridge this morning had a particular richness, Mrs. Thornby having added extra milk during its cooking. Beatrice stirred in a small spoonful of honey, watching the golden sweetness disappear into the pale grain. Each bite brought comfort, the kind of nourishment that seemed to settle not just in the stomach but somewhere deeper. Miss Pemberton mentioned that she would be visiting the employment agency today, hopping to hear of new situations. Her voice carried neither excitement nor dread, simply the practical acknowledgement of necessity. Beatrice offered encouragement, knowing from her own experience how uncertainty could sit heavily on the shoulders. After breakfast, she gathered her shawl and satchel, noting that the shawl would likely need to serve as protection against rain before the day ended. The air outside held dampness, though no drops had yet begun to fall. She set off at her usual pace, aware of how the threatening weather had affected the street's character. Fewer people lingered in doorways or paused to chat. Everyone moved with slightly greater purpose, as if trying to reach their destinations before the clouds made good on their promise. The flower vendor had not yet appeared, perhaps deciding to wait and see what the weather would bring. Beatrice, 26 years old, walked with her ink-stained fingers holding the satchel close. The familiar route unfolded before her, each landmark passing in its expected sequence. The baker's window displayed its goods behind glass that showed faint traces of condensation. The milliner's shop remained shuttered, opening later than the other establishments on this street. At the solicitor's firm, she entered through the side door and made her way to her workroom. The space felt cooler today, the walls seeming to hold the chill of the overcast morning. She arranged her materials with extra care, taking time to ensure everything sat in its proper place before beginning. The morning's work involved copying a lengthy contract concerning timber rights in Kent. The language was dense with legal terminology, requiring close attention to ensure accuracy. Her pen moved steadily across the page, each word transferred with deliberate precision. As she worked, she became aware of rain beginning outside. First came the softest patter against the window, individual drops making their presence known. Then the sound increased, becoming a steady rhythm that provided backdrop to her labors. The rain seemed to create a kind of shelter, the workroom becoming even more of a refuge. The hours passed in this cocoon of focus and ambient sound. Occasionally, she paused to flex her fingers or to check a particular phrase in the original document. The stack of completed pages grew steadily, each one representing progress through the lengthy contract. By midday, her eyes had begun to feel the strain of close reading. She set down her pen and moved to the window, looking out at the rain-darkened courtyard. Water pooled in the low spots of the paving stones, creating small mirrors that reflected the gray sky above. No birds ventured out in this weather. They had found their own shelters, waiting as she waited for the rain to pass. Her lunch today was bread with butter and a hard-boiled egg that Mrs. Thornby had thoughtfully included. The egg had been cooked perfectly, the yolk just set, still holding a trace of softness at its center. She ate slowly, grateful for the sustenance, listening to the rain's steady percussion against the glass. The afternoon brought different work, correspondence that required not just copying but occasional light editing to improve clarity. One of the junior partners had drafted responses that sometimes wandered from their point, and Beatrice had been given permission to refine the language where necessary. She approached this task with careful judgment, never altering the essential meaning but occasionally reorganizing a sentence for greater effect. Her ink-stained fingers held the pen with practiced confidence, making small changes that improved the letters without imposing her own voice upon them. The rain continued through the afternoon, sometimes heavier, sometimes lighter, but never entirely ceasing. The sound had become so constant that she barely noticed it, the way one stops hearing a clock's ticking after sufficient time. Yet when she did pause to listen consciously, she found the rhythm soothing, a reminder that some things proceeded regardless of human activity. By 4 o'clock, she had completed the correspondence and returned to the timber contract. Only a few pages remained, and she felt a quiet determination to finish before day's end. Her hand moved with renewed energy, carrying her through the final clauses and conditions until at last she wrote the closing phrases and set down her pen. The satisfaction of completion settled over her like a shawl. She allowed herself a moment to simply sit, hands resting on the desk, observing how the rain had made the afternoon darker than usual. The courtyard below lay in premature twilight, the wet stones gleaming dully. When she finally prepared to leave, she noticed that the rain had softened to a fine mist, not enough to keep one indoors but sufficient to make the shawl necessary. She draped it over her head and shoulders, tucking the edges close, then stepped out into the dampened street. The walk home revealed the city transformed by rain. Cobblestones shone with moisture, reflecting the newly lit lamps in wavering patterns. The air smelled of wet stone and earth, all the usual scents of coal and horses temporarily subdued by the cleansing water. People moved carefully, watching their footing, avoiding the deeper puddles. Beatrice proceeded at a slightly slower pace than usual, mindful of the slick surfaces. The mist settled on her shawl and face, cool and refreshing after hours in the workroom. She found herself noticing details that usually escaped attention. The way water dripped from eaves in irregular rhythms, how certain shops had placed wooden boards across their thresholds to keep the wet from entering. At the boarding house, the entrance hallway smelled of damp wool and the evening meal being prepared. She climbed the stairs carefully, her shoes leaving faint prints on the treads. In her room, she removed the damp shawl and hung it near the small fireplace, hoping it would dry by morning. Supper that evening featured beef stew, its rich gravy warming after the day's dampness. Mrs. Thornby had added carrots and turnips, their sweetness complementing the savory meat. Bread accompanied the stew, perfect for soaking up the thick liquid. The conversation at table turned naturally to the weather. Mr. Greaves predicted the rain would continue through tomorrow. Miss Pemberton mentioned that her visit to the employment agency had been postponed due to the conditions. Young Mr. Walsh expressed hope that the weekend would bring clearing skies, as he had planned an excursion to Greenwich. After supper, Beatrice returned to her room with its gradually warming air. The small fire Mrs. Thornby had kindled earlier now provided gentle heat, taking the edge off the dampness. She settled into her chair with the natural history book, opening to a new essay about river ecology. The author described the life of freshwater mussels, creatures that spent their entire existence in one location, filtering water and growing slowly over decades. The writing conveyed both scientific precision and a kind of wonder at these patient lives, these organisms that asked so little and provided so much. Outside, the mist had thickened into proper rain again. Beatrice could hear it against the window, steady and peaceful. The sound seemed to make the room feel even more sheltered, a small island of warmth and light in the wet darkness. She read until her eyes grew heavy, then marked her place and prepared for bed. The nightdress felt soft against her skin as she pulled it on. She brushed her chestnut hair with slow, meditative strokes, counting without quite meaning to 50, 100, 150. Beneath the worn quilt, she listened to the rain and the settling sounds of the boarding house. Someone walked past her door, footsteps soft and purposeful. A door closed somewhere below. The building itself seemed to sigh, contracting slightly in the cooler air. Beatrice, 26 years old, lay with her ink-stained fingers relaxed on the quilt. The day had been good, work completed, meals eaten, shelter maintained. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, varied only in small details. The thought brought contentment rather than restlessness. The church bells rang through the rain, their sound slightly muffled but still clear enough to count. 10 chimes marking the hour. She closed her eyes, feeling sleep approach with its familiar gentleness. The rain continued its quiet drumming. The room held its warmth. The city breathed on through the darkness, its countless inhabitants each tucked into their own spaces, each following their own patterns of rest and waking. In the morning, the rain might have passed, or it might continue. Either way, the day would unfold in its appointed manner. Beatrice would rise, dress, take breakfast, walk to the firm, complete her work, return home. The cycle would continue, reliable as the seasons, comforting as the worn quilt beneath which she now lay. Her breathing slowed and deepened. The weight of the day lifted from her shoulders. Sleep arrived softly, without announcement, carrying her down into its peaceful depths where no effort was required, where nothing needed attention, where all was simply quiet and still and exactly as it should be. The candle on the desk burned low, its flame barely moving in the windless room. The rain whispered against the window. The worn quilt rose and fell with each breath. All was peaceful, all was well, all was complete. Morning arrived with unexpected brightness. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming. Beatrice woke to sunlight streaming through her window with an intensity that seemed remarkable after yesterday's gray. She lay still for a moment, appreciating the play of light across the ceiling, the way it transformed familiar cracks and shadows into something almost beautiful. The air in her room held a freshness that made rising from bed a pleasure rather than a duty. She moved to the window and looked down at the street, where puddles reflected the blue sky like scattered fragments of mirror. A woman walked past carrying a basket, her dark dress vivid against the bright cobblestones. At the washstand, the water felt particularly cold this morning, perhaps having absorbed some chill from the previous day's rain. Beatrice splashed her face thoroughly, welcoming the sharpness that brought full alertness. She worked her chestnut hair into its accustomed arrangement, her ink-stained fingers moving through the ritual with practiced ease. Her gray wool dress hung ready on its peg. As she fastened the buttons, she noticed through the window how the sunlight caught the edges of buildings, making even the soot-darkened brick seem to glow. The city appeared renewed, as if the rain had washed away more than just surface dirt. Descending to breakfast, she found the household in particularly good spirits. Mrs. Thornby hummed as she moved between table and kitchen. Mr. Greaves actually smiled at his newspaper rather than frowning at it. Miss Pemberton looked rested, her face holding an expression of quiet hope. The porridge arrived steaming and substantial. Beatrice added a bit of cream from the small pitcher, watching it swirl through the grain like morning fog. Toast followed, its surface crisp and golden, releasing fragrance when she spread butter across it. The tea today tasted especially fine, Mrs. Thornby having used leaves from a newer tin. Miss Pemberton shared that the employment agency had sent word of a promising situation, a family in Belgravia seeking a governess for 2 young daughters. The interview was scheduled for this afternoon. Everyone at the table offered encouragement, Mr. Greaves mentioning that Belgravia families were generally known for fair treatment of staff. After breakfast, Beatrice gathered her belongings and stepped out into the transformed street. The air carried a crispness that spoke of changing seasons, summer finally beginning its retreat. She breathed deeply, catching scents of wet stone and distant chimney smoke, the familiar perfume of London made fresh by last night's cleansing. Her route to the solicitor's firm felt almost like a new journey. The sunlight revealed details usually obscured, the precise color of brick in different buildings, the varied textures of pavement stones, the way certain windows caught and reflected the morning brightness. She found herself noticing shops she passed daily but rarely truly observed. The baker had set out fresh loaves in his window, their crusts catching the light. A greengrocer arranged vegetables in careful pyramids, turnips, cabbages, carrots, all still showing traces of the earth from which they came. 2 cats sat on a sunny doorstep, washing their faces with methodical concentration. Beatrice, 26 years old, moved through this brightness with her customary measured pace. Her ink-stained fingers held her satchel, but today the familiar weight seemed lighter somehow, as if the improved weather had altered not just the city, but also the small burdens of daily life. At the firm, her workroom welcomed her with its reliable dimness, a contrast to the brilliance outside. She arranged her materials and settled into the day's tasks. The first document concerned property boundaries in Southwark, requiring careful attention to measurements and legal descriptions. As she worked, sunlight moved across her desk in a slow arc, marking time's passage more visibly than usual. The beam illuminated dust particles floating in the air, creating patterns that shifted and changed with each small disturbance. She found the effect strangely mesmerizing during brief pauses between documents. The morning's work proceeded steadily. Her pen moved across page after page, forming letters that would become legal records, binding agreements, permanent evidence of transactions and arrangements. There was satisfaction in this permanence, knowing that her careful copying would outlast the moment of its creation. By midday, she had completed the Southwark documents and moved on to correspondence. One letter required particular attention, a response to an inquiry about inheritance laws regarding unmarried women. The senior partner had drafted careful language, and Beatrice transcribed it with extra precision, knowing such matters held significance beyond mere legal technicality. Her lunch today consisted of bread with sliced ham and a small bunch of grapes that Mrs. Thornby had included as a surprise. The grapes were slightly past their prime but still sweet, each one bursting with flavor on her tongue. She ate them slowly, appreciating the simple luxury, watching through the window as clouds began to gather once more. The afternoon brought varied tasks. She copied several shorter letters, then turned to a complex document involving partnership dissolution. The language was dense, filled with conditions and contingencies, requiring sustained concentration to ensure accuracy. Her hand moved steadily, the rhythm of work carrying her through the intricate clauses. Hours passed in this focused state. The clouds thickened outside, dimming the afternoon light but bringing no rain. The courtyard below took on a muted quality, colors becoming softer, shadows less distinct. A few pigeons ventured out to peck at the stones, their movements languid in the heavy air. By 4 o'clock, she had completed all assigned work. Rather than leaving early, she took time to organize the materials on her desk, ensuring everything sat in perfect order for tomorrow's tasks. There was pleasure in this small act of preparation, creating readiness for work not yet begun. When she finally departed, the street had entered that transitional time between afternoon and evening. Workers streamed from buildings, their numbers greater than usual as the improved weather made the homeward journey more pleasant. Shops remained open, proprietors standing in doorways enjoying the mild air. Beatrice joined the flow of pedestrians, allowing herself to be carried along at their pace rather than maintaining her usual measured stride. The slight increase in speed felt liberating somehow, a small departure from routine that brought unexpected pleasure. Near Russell Square, she passed a small park where children played under the watchful eyes of nursemaids. Their voices carried across the grass, high and bright, punctuated by occasional laughter. She paused briefly to watch, remembering her own childhood in the countryside, days spent in similar carefree motion. The boarding house appeared ahead, its familiar facade promising shelter and sustenance. She climbed the steps and entered the hallway, where the scent of baking apples announced that Mrs. Thornby had prepared something special for supper. In her room, she removed her shawl and tidied her hair, noting in the mirror how the day had left its mark in the slight flush on her cheeks, the brightness in her eyes. Good days showed themselves in such small ways, she reflected, barely perceptible but somehow significant. Supper featured roasted chicken with potatoes and, as the scent had promised, baked apples for dessert. The fruit had been cooked with cinnamon and a touch of sugar, the flesh soft and fragrant. Miss Pemberton reported that her interview had gone well. The family seemed pleasant, the children agreeable, the terms fair. She expected to hear their decision within a few days. Conversation flowed easily around the table. Mr. Greaves shared an amusing story from his office involving misdirected correspondence. Young Mr. Walsh described a new exhibit at the British Museum that he recommended they all visit. Even quiet Mrs. Thornby contributed observations about the improved weather and what it might mean for autumn's approach. After supper, Beatrice climbed to her room as the last daylight faded from the sky. She lit her candle and settled into the chair by the window, opening the natural history book to continue reading. Tonight's essay described woodland ecosystems, the intricate relationships between trees, soil, fungi, and the countless creatures that inhabited such spaces. The writing conveyed how each element supported the others, creating systems of mutual benefit that had developed over centuries. Beatrice found herself drawn to this idea of interconnection, thinking about her own small place in the larger system of the city, her work supporting the solicitors, their work supporting clients, all of them participating in the vast network of commerce and law and daily life. Outside her window, evening settled over London. Lamps were lit in windows across the street, creating scattered points of warm light against the gathering darkness. Voices drifted up from below, someone singing in a neighboring house, the melody indistinct but pleasant. She read until her eyes grew tired, then prepared for bed with her usual care. The nightdress slipped over her head, its fabric soft from many washings. She brushed her chestnut hair, counting strokes without conscious intention, the repetitive motion soothing in itself. Beneath the worn quilt, she felt the day's pleasant fatigue settling into her bones. Her body seemed to sink deeper into the mattress than usual, as if the improved weather had somehow made rest more complete. Through the walls came the familiar sounds of the boarding house preparing for night, footsteps, closing doors, the creak of bed frames accepting weight. Beatrice, 26 years old, lay with her ink-stained fingers resting peacefully on the quilt. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant a half day of work followed by the relative leisure of Sunday. The prospect brought quiet satisfaction, the knowledge that rest awaited just beyond one more morning of labor. The church bells marked the hour, 10 chimes rolling across the rooftops. She listened to each one, noting how the sound seemed clearer tonight, as if the rain-washed air carried it with greater purity. When the last echo faded, she closed her eyes and allowed her mind to drift. Sleep approached gradually like fog rolling in from the river. Her breathing slowed and deepened. The room held its warmth and silence. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythms, but here in this small space, all was still. The candle flame wavered slightly, then steadied. The worn quilt rose and fell with each breath. Shadows played gently across the ceiling, shaped by the single point of light. All was peaceful, all was well. All was exactly as it should be in this moment, suspended between day and night, between waking and dreams, between the life lived and the rest that restores it. Her last conscious thought was of tomorrow's half-day, of Sunday's freedom, of simple pleasures waiting. Then even that faded, and there was only the deep, restorative darkness of sleep, carrying her down into its peaceful depths where nothing was required, nothing needed attention, where all simply was. Saturday morning arrived with a gentle mist that softened all the city's hard edges. Beatrice woke earlier than usual, her body anticipating the shortened workday ahead. The light through her window appeared diffused, almost dreamlike, turning familiar objects in her room into softer versions of themselves. She rose and moved through her morning preparations with unhurried attention. The water in the basin felt tepid rather than cold, as if the air itself held residual warmth from yesterday's sunshine. She worked her chestnut hair into its customary knot, though today she allowed a few strands to frame her face more loosely than during the regular work week. Her gray wool dress awaited on its peg. As she fastened the buttons, she thought about the afternoon ahead, a few free hours before Sunday's full rest. Perhaps she would visit the lending library or simply walk through one of the parks. The luxury of unstructured time felt precious, something to be savored rather than filled hastily. In the breakfast room, the atmosphere carried a lighter quality than weekday mornings. Mr. Greaves had set aside his newspaper in favor of a book. Miss Pemberton wore a small smile, still buoyed by Thursday's successful interview. Even young Mr. Walsh seemed less hurried, eating his porridge with measured enjoyment rather than his usual efficiency. The morning meal featured kippers alongside the usual porridge and toast. The fish had been cooked perfectly, its flesh flacking easily, releasing a savory richness that complemented the simpler foods. Beatrice ate slowly, conscious that this meal marked the beginning of her weekly reprieve from routine's strictest demands. Mrs. Thornby mentioned that she would be preparing a special supper for Sunday evening, a roasted joint of beef with Yorkshire pudding. The announcement brought pleased responses from around the table. Such meals punctuated the weeks, providing markers by which time could be measured in something other than work completed or tasks awaiting. After breakfast, Beatrice gathered her belongings and stepped into the misty street. The air held moisture without actually raining, creating halos around the street lamps that still burned in the half-light. She walked toward the solicitor's firm with her usual care, but today her steps felt lighter, animated by the knowledge that freedom waited just hours away. The route revealed itself through veils of mist. Buildings appeared gradually as she approached, their details emerging from the gray before fading again as she passed. Other pedestrians moved like shadows, their forms indistinct until the last moment when they solidified into clerks and shopkeepers and housemaids, all making their various ways through the morning. At the firm, her workroom felt particularly quiet on this Saturday morning. Many of the other offices remained empty, the senior partners working from home or not at all on weekends. The silence created a different quality of focus, as if the building itself had relaxed its usual formality. The morning's work consisted primarily of organizing and filing completed documents from the previous week. This task required less intense concentration than copying, allowing her mind to wander occasionally while her hands performed their familiar sorting and arranging. She moved papers from one stack to another, creating order from the week's accumulated efforts. Beatrice, 26 years old, worked with her ink-stained fingers moving through the documents with practiced efficiency. Each paper found its proper place in the filing system, becoming part of the firm's permanent records. There was satisfaction in this organizational work, seeing the week's labor transformed into neat categories and sequences. By mid-morning, she had completed the filing and turned to a single letter requiring transcription, a brief response to an inquiry about property valuations. The task took less than an hour, her pen moving smoothly across the page, forming the familiar legal phrases that needed no particular thought to reproduce accurately. When she finished, the clock showed 11:30. Saturday work officially ended at noon, but with her tasks complete, she began preparing to leave. She cleaned her pen with extra care, knowing it would sit unused until Monday. The inkwell received fresh blotting paper. Her desk was arranged with particular attention, creating a tableau of readiness for the week ahead. Stepping back into the misty street felt like entering a different world. The morning's work activities had largely concluded, giving way to the slower rhythms of Saturday afternoon. Shops displayed their wares with less urgency. People walked with greater leisure, pausing to chat or to examine window displays with actual interest rather than passing glances. Beatrice decided to walk toward Bloomsbury, where the lending library stood on a quiet side street. The route took her past Russell Square, where the mist had begun to lift, revealing patches of grass still dark with moisture. A few brave souls sat on benches despite the dampness, reading newspapers or simply watching the world pass by. The library occupied the ground floor of a Georgian townhouse, its entrance marked by a modest sign. Inside, the familiar scent of old books and beeswax greeted her. The reading room held perhaps a dozen people scattered among the tables and chairs, each absorbed in their own pursuit of knowledge or story. She returned the natural history volume she had been reading, then wandered among the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines of books. Nothing immediately called to her, so she allowed herself the pleasure of browsing without purpose, reading titles and authors, occasionally pulling a volume free to examine its contents. In the section devoted to travel narratives, she discovered a slim book about the Scottish Highlands. The author described walking tour through remote glens and over mountain passes, encounters with shepherds and crofters, observations of wildlife and weather. She read a few pages standing there, then decided to borrow it, attracted by the descriptions of landscapes so different from London's dense urbanity. Leaving the library, she found the mist had lifted entirely. Weak sunlight filtered through the remaining clouds, creating a pale illumination that made the afternoon feel suspended between seasons. She walked without particular destination, allowing her feet to choose the route, discovering streets she rarely traveled despite years of living in this neighborhood. On a narrow lane behind the British Museum, she passed a small tea shop she had never noticed before. Its window displayed cakes and pastries, and through the glass she could see several tables occupied by women taking their afternoon refreshment. On impulse, she entered, drawn by the warmth and the scent of baking. The proprietress, a woman of middle years with flour-dusted hands, greeted her pleasantly. Beatrice ordered tea and a slice of seed cake, then settled at a small table near the window. The tea arrived in a plain white cup, strong and hot. The cake was dense and moist, flavored with caraway seeds that released their distinctive taste with each bite. She ate slowly, watching the street through the window. A cat prowled along the opposite pavement, pausing to investigate a doorway before continuing its patrol. Two men passed carrying a ladder between them, engaged in conversation that caused them both to laugh. An elderly woman walked by with a market basket, its contents covered with a checked cloth. The simple act of sitting in this unfamiliar place, consuming tea and cake while afternoon light shifted through the window, brought unexpected contentment. Beatrice, 26 years old, with her chestnut hair and ink-stained fingers, felt a moment of quiet gratitude for this small freedom, this unhurried hour belonging entirely to herself. When she finished, she paid the proprietress and stepped back into the street. The walk home took her through alleys and squares she seldom visited, creating a sense of exploration within thoroughly familiar territory. The city revealed itself differently when approached without haste, details emerging that usually passed unnoticed. At the boarding house, the afternoon stretched ahead with its gentle emptiness. In her room, she removed her shawl and settled into the chair by the window with the borrowed book about Scotland. The author's descriptions of mountains and lochs carried her far from London streets into landscapes of stone and heather and rushing water. She read until the light began to fail, then set the book aside and simply sat, watching evening arrive. The street below transformed gradually, lamps being lit one by one, windows glowing with interior warmth. Voices drifted up from the pavement, neighbors greeting each other, children being called inside, the ordinary sounds of day's end. Supper that evening featured mutton chops with boiled potatoes and greens. Mrs. Thornby had prepared the meal with her usual competence, the meat tender and well-seasoned. Conversation around the table touched on plans for Sunday. Mr. Greaves intended to visit his sister in Islington. Miss Pemberton would attend morning service at her parish church. Young Mr. Walsh spoke of a cricket match in Regent's Park. After supper, Beatrice returned to her room as full darkness settled over the city. She lit her candle and prepared for bed earlier than usual, feeling pleasantly tired from the day's walking and the week's accumulated labors. The nightdress slipped over her head, its familiar softness welcoming against her skin. She brushed her chestnut hair with long, meditative strokes, counting without conscious intention. 100 strokes, then 20 more for good measure. The repetitive motion soothed her mind, preparing it for sleep's arrival. Beneath the worn quilt, she felt the satisfaction of a week completed and a day of rest earned. Sunday would bring its own quiet pleasures, late rising, leisurely breakfast, perhaps a walk if the weather held. But for now, there was only this moment of settling, of allowing body and mind to release their hold on activity and purpose. The church bells rang 9 times, earlier than her usual bedtime but appropriate for this evening of extended rest. She closed her eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of the boarding house, footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, a door closing somewhere below. Sleep approached with unusual swiftness, perhaps hastened by the afternoon's walking or simply by the body's recognition that rest was not just permitted but intended. Her breathing deepened and slowed. The worn quilt rose and fell in steady rhythm. Outside, Saturday night unfolded over London. In public houses, voices rose in song and conversation. In theaters, performances moved toward their conclusions. In thousands of small rooms like this one, people prepared for sleep or for waking, each following their own patterns, each participating in the vast, intricate dance of the city's life. But here, in this particular room on the 3rd floor of Mrs. Thornby's boarding house, all was peaceful and still. The candle burned low, its flame barely moving in the windless air. Shadows held their positions on the walls and ceiling. Time seemed to slow, then suspend entirely, creating a pocket of perfect rest. Beatrice's last conscious thought was of tomorrow's freedom, of hours belonging entirely to herself, of simple pleasures requiring no effort or obligation. Then even that thought dissolved, and there was only the deep, restorative darkness of sleep, carrying her down into dreams of Scottish mountains and London streets, of ink-stained fingers and chestnut hair, of all the small details that comprised a life lived with quiet attention and modest contentment. The worn quilt held its warmth. The room breathed softly. The city murmured on through the night. And in this small sanctuary of rest, all was exactly, precisely, perfectly as it should be. Sunday morning announced itself with the sound of church bells, their voices layered and overlapping as different parishes called their congregations to worship. Beatrice woke slowly, luxuriating in the knowledge that no work awaited, no schedule demanded her attention. She remained beneath the worn quilt for long minutes, simply listening to the bells and the quiet stirring of the boarding house. When she finally rose, the sun had climbed higher than on any workday morning. Light filled her room with a warmth that felt almost celebratory, as if the day itself recognized its special character. She moved to the window and looked down at the street, where people walked in their Sunday clothes, dark suits for men, best dresses for women, children scrubbed clean and wearing their most careful expressions. Her own preparations unfolded without haste. The water in the basin felt pleasant rather than bracing. She worked her chestnut hair into a slightly more elaborate arrangement than usual, allowing herself the extra minutes this styling required. Her best dress, a deep blue wool kept for Sundays and special occasions, hung freshly brushed and ready. The fabric felt smooth as she fastened the buttons, the color bringing out tones in her complexion that the everyday gray concealed. She pinned a small brooch at her collar, a simple piece inherited from her mother, silver worked into the shape of a leaf. These small touches transformed her appearance subtly but significantly, marking this day as different from all others. Descending to breakfast, she found the dining room bathed in sunshine. Mrs. Thornby had set the table with greater care than weekdays, using the better china and arranging a small vase of late-season flowers as a centerpiece. The blooms, purchased yesterday from the corner vendor, added their subtle fragrance to the room. The Sunday breakfast offered pleasures beyond the everyday fare. Eggs arrived soft-boiled in their shells, accompanied by buttered toast cut into soldiers for dipping. Bacon lay crisp and savory on a serving plate. A pot of jam, strawberry preserves made by Mrs. Thornby herself last summer, sat open and inviting. Beatrice, 26 years old, cracked the top of her egg with gentle taps, revealing the golden yolk within. She dipped a strip of toast, watching the butter and yolk combine into something richer than either alone. Each bite carried the taste of Sunday itself, unhurried, indulgent in its modest way, a weekly reminder that life held more than labor and obligation. Mr. Greaves had already departed for Islington to visit his sister. Miss Pemberton sat finishing her tea, dressed for church in a black dress with modest lace at the collar. Young Mr. Walsh consumed his breakfast with enthusiasm, eager to be off to the cricket match. The conversation flowed easily, no one rushing, the meal extending past its usual duration simply because it could. After breakfast, Beatrice returned to her room to collect her shawl and the book about Scotland. She had decided to spend the morning in one of the nearby squares, reading in whatever sunshine the day provided. The prospect of hours devoted entirely to leisure felt almost decadent, a luxury she savored in anticipation. The street outside held its Sunday character, quieter than weekdays, less purposeful, people moving at a pace that suggested destination mattered less than journey. She walked toward Tavistock Square, where she knew benches offered both sun and shade, and where the garden's relative seclusion promised peaceful hours. The square's iron gates stood open, welcoming visitors to the ordered pathways within. Trees still held most of their leaves, though some had begun to turn golden at the edges. Flower beds displayed the last blooms of summer alongside the first plantings of autumn. A few other people had claimed benches, an elderly couple sharing a newspaper, a young woman sketching in a small book, a nursemaid watching two children play with a ball on the grass. Beatrice chose a bench in dappled shade, positioning herself where shifting patterns of light and shadow would not trouble her reading. She settled onto the wooden slats, their surface worn smooth by countless previous sitters, and opened the book to where she had left off. The author described an evening spent in a Highland cottage, sharing a simple meal with a shepherd and his wife. The writing conveyed not just the physical details, the peat fire's glow, the taste of oatcakes and cheese, the sound of wind outside, but also the quality of the silence between strangers who had found unexpected fellowship. She read slowly, allowing each sentence its full weight, occasionally pausing to look up at the trees or to watch clouds drift across the sky. Time passed in this suspended way, measured only by the progress through pages and the sun's gradual arc overhead. Her body relaxed completely into the bench, shoulders releasing tensions she had not realized they carried. The city sounds formed a distant backdrop, church bells marking the hour, carriages on nearby streets, birds calling from the trees, but none of it intruded on the peaceful cocoon of her attention. By midday, she had read several chapters and felt the pleasant fatigue that came from sustained focus. She closed the book and simply sat, watching life unfold in the square. The children had been called away by their nursemaid. The sketching woman had departed. New visitors arrived, a family with 3 daughters, all dressed identically in white pinafores, a gentleman with a walking stick who proceeded along the paths with measured dignity, 2 young men engaged in animated conversation. The sun had reached its height, pouring warmth over the square with generous intensity. Beatrice closed her eyes and turned her face toward it, feeling the heat against her eyelids, her cheeks, her forehead. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine she sat not in London, but in some Scottish glen, surrounded by heather and stone, with nothing but sky above and earth below. When she opened her eyes again, the square had returned, but seemed somehow refreshed, as if the brief imaginative journey had granted new appreciation for this cultivated green space amid the city's density. She gathered her belongings and began walking, not toward the boarding house but deeper into Bloomsbury, following impulse rather than plan. Her wandering took her past elegant townhouses and smaller shops closed for the Sabbath. She paused before a bookseller's window, examining titles displayed behind glass. A collection of poetry caught her eye, verses by someone named Christina Rossetti, a name she did not recognize. She made a mental note to inquire at the lending library whether they carried this author's work. Further on, she passed a small church just as its congregation emerged from service. People spilled onto the pavement in groups, some dispersing quickly toward home, others lingering to chat. She heard fragments of conversation, whether observations, mentions of upcoming harvest festivals, discussion of the morning's sermon. The voices carried contentment, the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and community maintained. By the time she returned to the boarding house, afternoon had settled into its long, golden phase. The building welcomed her with familiar scents. The roast beef Mrs. Thornby had mentioned was now cooking, filling the hallways with rich, savory promise. Beatrice climbed to her room and removed her good dress, hanging it carefully before changing into a simpler house dress of soft gray cotton. The afternoon hours stretched ahead with nothing required. She settled into her chair with the Scottish book, reading another chapter before setting it aside to simply gaze out the window. The street below had grown quieter as afternoon deepened, most people now at home preparing for or consuming Sunday dinner. At 5 o'clock, she descended to the dining room, where the table had been set with Sunday formality. The roast beef sat on its platter, surrounded by roasted potatoes and carrots. Yorkshire pudding, golden and risen, occupied a separate dish. Mrs. Thornby had made gravy that caught the lamplight with an almost glossy sheen. The household gathered. Even Mr. Greaves had returned from Islington in time for supper. Miss Pemberton looked refreshed from her church service. Young Mr. Walsh regaled them with accounts of the cricket match, which his team had won by a narrow margin. Mrs. Thornby accepted compliments on the beef with modest pleasure, clearly satisfied with her efforts. Beatrice ate slowly, savoring each component of the meal. The beef had been cooked to perfect tenderness, yielding easily to her knife. The Yorkshire pudding, crisp at the edges and soft within, absorbed the rich gravy beautifully. The vegetables carried the sweetness that came from slow roasting, their edges caramelized and flavorful. Conversation around the table held an easiness born of shared satisfaction. Mr. Greaves reported that his sister sent her regards to Mrs. Thornby and hoped to visit soon. Miss Pemberton mentioned she expected word about the governess position by Tuesday. Young Mr. Walsh described a spectacular catch that had secured his team's victory, his enthusiasm making even those uninterested in cricket smile at his animation. After supper, they lingered at the table longer than usual, Mrs. Thornby producing a treacle tart for dessert, another special Sunday indulgence. The tart's sweetness provided perfect contrast to the meal's savory richness. Beatrice ate her portion with conscious appreciation, knowing such treats marked time in their own way, creating memories that distinguished one week from another. When the meal finally concluded, she climbed once more to her room as evening approached. The day's accumulated contentment settled over her like a comfortable shawl. She had done nothing of consequence, achieved nothing measurable, yet the hours felt rich with their own value. She lit her candle and opened the Scottish book again, reading a final chapter as twilight deepened outside her window. The author described reaching the end of a long day's walking, coming upon a loch just as sunset painted the water in shades of copper and gold. The passage conveyed both the physical beauty of the scene and the walker's inner state, tired but satisfied, alone but not lonely, part of the landscape rather than merely passing through it. Beatrice found herself nodding in recognition, though her own day had involved no physical exertion beyond gentle walking. Yet she understood the feeling described, the sense of completion, of time well spent even in apparent idleness, of being exactly where one should be. She prepared for bed as full darkness arrived. The nightdress received her with its familiar softness. She brushed her chestnut hair, counting strokes without hurry. 100, then more, the rhythm soothing in itself, requiring no thought, simply the repetition of motion and the gentle pull against her scalp. Beneath the worn quilt, she reflected on the day that had passed. Sunday's gift was this: permission to exist without purpose, to move through hours without agenda, to simply be rather than do. Tomorrow would return her to the world of obligation and schedule, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that such respite came reliably, weekly, a rhythm as dependable as the church bells that had called the morning into being. The bells rang now for 9 o'clock, their sound rolling across the rooftops. She counted them silently, marking the hour without anxiety. Sleep would come in its own time, and she was content to wait, suspended in this peaceful space between day and night. Her ink-stained fingers rested on the quilt, relaxed and still. Tomorrow they would return to work, holding the pen for hours, forming letters that bound people to contracts and agreements. But tonight they simply rested, asking nothing, offering nothing, complete in their stillness. Outside, Sunday evening unfolded over London. In some homes, families gathered around fires, reading or talking quietly. In others, people prepared for the week ahead, laying out clothes or reviewing obligations. The city itself seemed to breathe more slowly on Sunday nights, as if even its great mechanical heart recognized the need for occasional rest. Beatrice's breathing deepened and slowed. Her body sank into the mattress, releasing the last traces of waking tension. Sleep approached with its familiar gentleness, carrying no demands, simply offering its restorative darkness. Her last thought was of tomorrow, not with dread but with quiet acceptance. The week would unfold in its appointed manner, bringing work and routine, small satisfactions and minor challenges. She would meet it as she always did, with patient attention and modest capability, moving through her days with the same unhurried grace that had carried her through this Sunday. Then even that thought faded, and there was only the deep, peaceful stillness of sleep, the worn quilt rising and falling with each breath, the candle burning low, the room holding its warmth and silence, the city breathing on through the darkness. And in this small space, this particular moment, everything exactly, precisely, perfectly as it should be. Monday morning arrived with clouds that promised rain, but delivered only a persistent grayness. Beatrice woke to the sound of carts in the street below, the city resuming its weekday rhythms with customary punctuality. The interlude of Sunday had passed, and now the familiar pattern reasserted itself. Rise, dress, work, return, rest. She moved through her morning preparations with the efficiency that came from countless repetitions. The water in the basin felt cold against her skin, bringing the alertness necessary for the day ahead. Her chestnut hair submitted to her ink-stained fingers, forming the practical knot she wore for work. The gray wool dress awaited on its peg, ready to clothe her for another day at the solicitor's firm. In the breakfast room, the atmosphere had returned to its weekday character. Mr. Greaves frowned at his newspaper, marking some article with evident disapproval. Miss Pemberton ate quietly, her expression thoughtful, perhaps contemplating the response from the Belgravia family that might arrive tomorrow. Young Mr. Walsh consumed his porridge with renewed haste, his weekend leisure already a fading memory. The porridge this morning tasted as it always did, plain, substantial, neither particularly pleasant nor unpleasant. Beatrice added a small amount of milk and ate steadily, fueling her body for the work ahead. Toast followed, and tea that had grown slightly cool by the time she poured it. These minor imperfections seemed appropriate for Monday, the day that asked the most after asking the least. After breakfast, she gathered her belongings and stepped into the gray morning. The street held none of Sunday's peaceful quality. People moved with purpose now, their faces set toward destinations that demanded arrival. Shop shutters were being opened, proprietors preparing for commerce. The flower vendor had returned to her corner, though her offerings looked sparse after the weekend. Beatrice, 26 years old, joined the flow of workers making their way through the city. Her route unfolded exactly as it did every weekday, past the baker's window with its morning offerings, past the milliner's shop now open and displaying autumn bonnets, across the intersection where she always paused for traffic, down the familiar streets toward the firm. The solicitor's building appeared ahead, its windows reflecting the overcast sky. She entered through the side door and made her way to her workroom, where a new week's accumulation of documents awaited her attention. The stack seemed particularly tall this morning, the result of matters that had arrived late Friday or been delivered over the weekend. She arranged her materials with methodical care, fresh ink in the well, new nibs laid out beside her pen, blotting paper positioned within easy reach. The ritual of preparation helped settle her mind into the focused state that work required. When everything sat properly positioned, she drew the first document toward her and began. The morning's work involved copying a lengthy lease agreement for commercial premises near the docks. The language was technical, filled with specifications about tonnage and storage capacity, loading facilities and access to waterways. Her pen moved across the page, transcribing terms she barely understood but reproduced with perfect accuracy. Hours passed in this concentrated state. The scratch of her pen against paper became almost meditative, a rhythm that carried her forward without conscious thought. Occasionally, she paused to replenish her ink or to flex her fingers, but these interruptions barely registered. The work itself created a kind of trance, purposeful and absorbing. By midday, her hand had developed the familiar ache that came from sustained writing. She set down her pen and moved to the window, looking out at the gray courtyard below. A few pigeons picked their way across the stones, their movements desultory in the dull light. No sun appeared to mark time's passage. The day held the same flat illumination from morning until now. Her lunch consisted of bread with cheese and a hard apple that Mrs. Thornby had included. The apple required considerable chewing, its flesh dense and slightly mealy. She ate it anyway, knowing nutrition mattered more than enjoyment, that fuel served work whether or not it brought pleasure. The afternoon brought different documents, correspondence with clients about various ongoing matters. One letter required particular care, addressing a widow whose late husband's estate involved complicated questions of property ownership. The senior partner had drafted language that combined legal precision with gentle compassion, and Beatrice copied it with extra attention, knowing such letters mattered beyond their mere words. As she worked, she became aware of voices in the corridor outside her room, two of the clerks discussing some matter with evident disagreement. Their words remained indistinct, but the tone carried frustration. She focused more intently on her copying, using the work to block out the distraction, maintaining the quiet cocoon necessary for accurate transcription. The church bells marked 3 o'clock, then 4. The light through her window remained unchanged, the gray day offering no dramatic shift from afternoon toward evening. Only the clock and bells marked time's passage, measuring hours that felt both long and oddly compressed, the way Monday always did. By the time she finished her work, the completed stack nearly matched the height of the morning's unfinished pile. Tomorrow would bring more, she knew. The flow never truly ceased, only ebbed and surged according to patterns she could observe but not control. She cleaned her pen with extra thoroughness, suspecting she would need its reliable performance throughout the week ahead. Outside, the street had begun its evening transformation. Workers streamed from buildings, their number and pace unchanged by the day's grayness. If anything, people moved more quickly, eager perhaps to reach home and escape the oppressive overcast that had persisted since morning. Beatrice joined this homeward flow, her shawl drawn close against air that had grown noticeably cooler as the day progressed. The walk revealed nothing new or remarkable. The same buildings, the same shops beginning their closing routines, the same faces she passed daily without truly seeing. Monday's return to routine extended even to this, the predictability both comforting and somehow deflating after Sunday's small adventures. At the boarding house, she climbed the stairs to her room and removed her shawl, noting how the day's chill had settled into the fabric. She hung it near the small fireplace, though no fire burned there yet. Mrs. Thornby conserved fuel carefully, lighting fires only when temperatures truly demanded them. Supper that evening featured a simple stew, mutton with vegetables, the broth thin but flavorful enough. Bread accompanied it, yesterday's loaves now slightly stale but still serviceable. No one spoke much during the meal. Monday seemed to impose a collective fatigue, each resident absorbed in their own transition back to weekly obligations. Miss Pemberton mentioned briefly that she expected word from the Belgravia family tomorrow. Mr. Greaves commented on an upcoming change in postal regulations. Young Mr. Walsh said little, appearing tired from his day at the exchange. Even Mrs. Thornby moved with less animation than usual, serving the meal efficiently but without her customary warmth. After supper, Beatrice returned to her room as evening settled into night. She lit her candle and retrieved the Scottish book, opening it without particular enthusiasm. The author described climbing a mountain path, the effort required to ascend steep slopes, the way breath came harder at higher elevations. She read a few pages but found her attention wandering, the words failing to transport her as they had on Sunday. She set the book aside and simply sat by the window, watching darkness complete its takeover of the street below. Lamps were lit, creating their familiar pools of yellow light. Occasional pedestrians passed, their forms shadowy and indistinct. The city settled into its evening character, quieter than day but never truly still, always breathing, always moving, the great mechanism that never fully rested. Her thoughts drifted without settling anywhere in particular. She contemplated the week ahead, 4 more days of copying documents, 4 more evening meals in the boarding house, 4 more walks to and from the firm. The repetition that usually brought comfort felt tonight like weight, something to be borne rather than embraced. She recognized this mood as part of Monday itself, the day that demanded readjustment after Sunday's respite. By tomorrow, the weight would have lessened. By Wednesday, the routine would have reasserted its comfortable rhythm. But tonight, on this gray evening after this gray day, she allowed herself to feel the full burden of sameness, the challenge of facing yet another week identical to all those that had come before. Eventually, she prepared for bed, moving through the familiar sequence without conscious thought. Nightdress on, hair brushed, fewer strokes tonight, perhaps 60 instead of the usual 100. The motions felt mechanical, performed by a body that knew its duties even when the mind had disengaged. Beneath the worn quilt, she lay listening to the boarding house settle for the night. Footsteps in the hallway, a door closing, the creak of Mr. Greaves's bed frame in the adjacent room. These sounds usually brought comfort, the evidence of shared humanity, of others engaged in the same simple acts of existing. Tonight they simply marked time, one moment following another in endless succession. The church bells rang 10 times, their sound flat in the heavy air. She counted them automatically, feeling neither peace nor distress, simply awareness that another hour had passed, that sleep would eventually come whether she welcomed it or not. Beatrice, 26 years old, closed her eyes and waited. Her ink-stained fingers rested on the quilt, tomorrow's work already written into their muscle memory. Her chestnut hair spread across the pillow, having served its purpose of propriety for another day. The gray dress hung on its peg, ready to clothe her again when morning came. Outside, Monday night continued over London. In counting houses, final tallies were being recorded. In workshops, tools were being cleaned and stored. In thousands of small rooms, people prepared for sleep or for waking, each following their patterns, each playing their part in the vast, intricate system that was the city itself. Sleep approached slowly tonight, reluctant or perhaps simply unhurried. Her breathing gradually deepened. Her body released its tensions incrementally, muscle by muscle, thought by thought. The day's grayness persisted even into this descent toward unconsciousness, coloring everything with its dull neutrality. But sleep came nonetheless, as it always did, bringing its necessary restoration. The worn quilt rose and fell with steady rhythm. The candle burned down to a stub before guttering out. The room held its darkness and silence. And in this small space, this particular moment, Monday concluded as it always did, not with drama or satisfaction, but with simple cessation, one day ending so another could begin. The wheel turning, the pattern continuing, everything proceeding exactly as it must, exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would. The city breathed on through the night. The boarding house held its sleeping occupants, and Beatrice descended into dreams where gray days and ink-stained fingers and worn quilts dissolved into something softer, something without weight or obligation, something that asked nothing and gave everything, the deep, restorative darkness that made tomorrow possible, whatever tomorrow might bring. Tuesday morning arrived with a change in the weather. Beatrice woke to the sound of rain against her window, steady and insistent, the kind that promised to continue for hours. She remained beneath the worn quilt for a few extra moments, listening to the water's rhythm, feeling grateful for the roof above her head and the dry warmth of her small room. When she finally rose, the air held a dampness that seemed to have penetrated even through the walls. She moved to the washstand and poured water from the pitcher, noting how the cold seemed more pronounced this morning, as if the rain had drawn all warmth from the world. The water against her face brought sharp wakefulness, banishing the last traces of sleep's comfortable fog. Her gray wool dress would serve well today, its weight appropriate for the cooler, wetter conditions. She fastened the buttons with her ink-stained fingers, already anticipating the walk to work through rain-slicked streets. Her shawl would provide some protection, but she knew from experience that she would arrive at the firm with damp shoulders and wet him regardless of precautions. Descending to breakfast, she found the household subdued by the weather. The dining room seemed darker than usual, the gray light from the windows barely illuminating the table. Mrs. Thornby had lit an extra lamp, its glow creating a circle of warmth that failed to reach the room's corners. The morning porridge arrived steaming, its heat more welcome than usual. Beatrice added milk and ate slowly, letting each spoonful warm her from within. Toast followed, and tea that she held between her palms for a moment before drinking, appreciating the simple comfort of heat against her skin. Miss Pemberton appeared particularly quiet this morning, her face showing signs of poor sleep. Today was the day she expected word from the Belgravia family, and the waiting had clearly affected her rest. She picked at her breakfast without real appetite, her attention divided between her plate and the hallway, as if the post might arrive at any moment. After breakfast, Beatrice prepared for her journey through the rain. She wrapped her shawl tightly and stepped into the wet street, where water ran along the gutters in swift streams. The cobblestones gleamed darkly, reflecting the gray sky above. Pedestrians moved with hunched shoulders, each person focused on their own discomfort, the usual acknowledgments and nods abandoned in favor of simply enduring. The rain fell steadily, not a downpour but a persistent soaking presence. Beatrice, 26 years old, walked with careful attention to her footing, avoiding the deeper puddles while accepting that some wetness was inevitable. Her shawl grew heavy with absorbed moisture. Water found its way past her collar, trickling cold against her neck. The familiar route seemed longer today, each block requiring extra effort. The baker's window showed condensation on its glass, obscuring the loaves within. The milliner's shop remained dark. Perhaps the proprietress had decided the weather warranted a late opening. Few people ventured out unnecessarily, and those who did moved with grim determination. At the solicitor's firm, the entrance hallway smelled of wet wool and damp leather. Other employees arrived shaking water from their coats and hats, creating small pools on the floor that the porter mopped with resigned efficiency. Beatrice made her way to her workroom, grateful to reach its relative dryness. She removed her wet shawl and hung it on the peg by the door, where it dripped slowly onto the floorboards. Her dress had darkened where rain had penetrated, the fabric clinging uncomfortably to her shoulders. She arranged her work materials with chilled fingers that took several minutes to regain their full dexterity. The morning's work consisted of copying correspondence related to a property dispute in Hampstead. Two neighbors had fallen into disagreement about a boundary wall, and the resulting letters had grown increasingly formal and stiff. Beatrice transcribed the measured language, noting how legal phrasing transformed personal grievance into something abstract and procedural. As she worked, the rain continued its steady percussion against her window. The sound created a kind of isolation, cutting her workroom off from the world beyond. She found herself falling into a deeper concentration than usual, the rain's rhythm somehow conducive to sustained focus. Hours passed in this absorbed state, her pen moving steadily, the stack of completed documents growing. By midday, the room had grown noticeably colder. No fire had been lit in the building's small grates, The season hadn't quite turned enough to justify the expense. Beatrice worked with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, though its dampness provided more discomfort than warmth. Her fingers had stiffened slightly, requiring conscious effort to maintain her usual clarity of penmanship. Her lunch today consisted of bread with cold meat and an orange that Mrs. Thornby had thoughtfully included. The orange's bright color seemed particularly vivid against the day's grayness. She peeled it carefully, the citrus scent rising sharp and clean in the damp air. Each segment burst with flavor on her tongue, bringing a momentary brightness to the dreary afternoon. The hours after lunch stretched long. The rain showed no sign of diminishing, and the persistent gray light made it difficult to judge time's passage. Only the church bells marking 2 o'clock, then 3, provided evidence that the day advanced at all. Her hand grew tired from sustained writing, the muscles between thumb and forefinger developing a dull ache that would persist into evening. By 4 o'clock, she had completed all assigned work and began organizing materials for tomorrow. This task required less concentration, allowing her mind to wander. She thought of Miss Pemberton, wondering whether the expected letter had arrived, whether good news or disappointment awaited at the boarding house. She thought of her own situation, years of steady copying work, reliable income but no prospect of significant change, a life defined more by its constancy than by any particular achievement or aspiration. These thoughts carried neither distress nor satisfaction, simply observation. She had made her choices: to leave her village and seek work in London, to accept this position, to live in Mrs. Thornby's boarding house, to structure her days around this particular routine. Other paths had been possible once but had closed as time passed and choices accumulated. This was her life now, and dwelling on alternatives served no purpose. When she finally left the firm, the rain had lessened to a fine mist. The street gleamed with moisture, every surface slick and reflective. She began the walk home with her damp shawl drawn close, her feet growing cold in shoes that had never quite dried from the morning's journey. The route home revealed the day's effects on the city. Gutters overflowed in places, creating obstacles that required careful navigation. Shop windows showed condensation inside and out, the glass nearly opaque. Fewer people were abroad than usual, and those she passed looked as bedraggled as she felt, united in shared discomfort. At the boarding house, warmth and light greeted her. Mrs. Thornby had lit a fire in the common room, a rare concession to the day's persistent chill. The scent of something cooking drifted from the kitchen, soup perhaps, something hot and nourishing to combat the weather. Beatrice climbed the stairs to her room, her wet shoes leaving faint prints on the treads. She removed her damp clothing and changed into a dry house dress, feeling immediate relief as warm fabric replaced cold. Her hair had frizzed from the moisture, requiring fresh attention. She worked it back into order with patient persistence, her ink-stained fingers performing their familiar task. Descending for supper, she found the household gathered in unusual solidarity. The fire in the common room had drawn everyone together before the meal, each person grateful for its warmth. Miss Pemberton sat nearest the flames, and Beatrice noted immediately from her expression that news had arrived. "The position is mine," Miss Pemberton said quietly when the question came. "I begin next Monday." Congratulations circled the room, genuine pleasure expressed by all. Yet beneath the happy words, Beatrice detected something else, awareness that their small community would lose a member, that change had entered their reliable routine. Miss Pemberton had lived in the boarding house for nearly 2 years. Her departure would leave an absence that no new resident could quite fill, regardless of their qualities. Supper featured the soup Beatrice had anticipated, a thick vegetable broth with barley, accompanied by fresh bread still warm from the oven. The heat of the soup seemed to penetrate to her very core, dispelling the last of the day's accumulated chill. She ate with genuine appreciation, grateful for food and shelter, and the company of people who, while not family, still constituted a kind of belonging. After supper, she returned to her room as evening darkened into night. The fire Mrs. Thornby had lit earlier had been allowed to die down, the coal too precious to maintain throughout the evening. Beatrice lit her candle and wrapped herself in a blanket before settling with the Scottish book. The author tonight described a night spent in a shepherd's hut during a storm. The writing conveyed the wildness outside, wind howling, rain lashing, and the profound security of shelter, the ancient human gratitude for walls and roof and fire. Beatrice read with particular attention, recognizing something of her own day in the description, though her own discomfort had been mild compared to what the author described. She read until the candle burned low, then prepared for bed with numbed fingers that fumbled slightly with buttons and brushes. The room had grown cold, the day's dampness having settled into everything. She pulled on her nightdress quickly and dove beneath the worn quilt, curling into herself for warmth. Sleep came slowly despite her fatigue. The cold seemed to prevent full relaxation, her body maintaining a slight tension against the chill. Through the walls came sounds of the boarding house, footsteps, closing doors, the creak of bed frames. Outside, the rain had resumed, drumming steadily against the window. Beatrice, 26 years old, lay listening to the rain and thinking about Miss Pemberton's departure, about change entering their established pattern. Someone new would take the vacant room, bringing their own habits and history. The household would adjust as it always did, finding a new equilibrium. But something would be lost, the particular chemistry of this group of people displaced by something different, not necessarily worse or better, simply other. The church bells rang 10 times, their sound muffled by rain and distance. She counted them in her mind, marking another hour past, another day nearly complete. Tomorrow would be Wednesday, the week's midpoint, after which days would begin their slow descent towards Saturday's half measure and Sunday's rest. Her breathing gradually deepened despite the cold. Her body released its tensions incrementally, accepting that warmth would come from the quilt's accumulated heat rather than from any external source. The rain continued its steady rhythm, a constant presence that gradually shifted from intrusion to lullaby. Sleep arrived finally, bringing its necessary restoration. The worn quilt rose and fell with each breath. The room held its darkness and its cold. Outside, the rain-soaked city continued its life, water flowing through gutters, lights burning in windows, the endless respiration of commerce and domesticity proceeding regardless of weather or discomfort. And in this small room, Beatrice descended into sleep where rain and cold and ink-stained fingers dissolved into formless rest, the deep unconsciousness that asked nothing and restored everything, carrying her through the night toward whatever Wednesday might bring, the wheel turning, the pattern continuing, the life she had chosen unfolding one day after another in its appointed manner. Wednesday morning brought clearing skies and cooler temperatures. Beatrice woke to find pale sunlight streaming through her window, the rain having passed during the night. She rose and moved to the glass, looking down at a street transformed by the departure of the weather. Puddles remained in the low spots of the pavement, catching the morning light like scattered coins, but the oppressive dampness had lifted. The air in her room felt crisp rather than cold, invigorating rather than uncomfortable. She poured water into the basin and found it shockingly chilly, bringing immediate alertness with its touch against her skin. Her chestnut hair submitted to her ink-stained fingers with cooperative ease, as if even it responded to the improved conditions. Her gray wool dress, now fully dry from yesterday's soaking, felt light and comfortable as she fastened the buttons. The fabric had retained a faint scent of rain, not unpleasant, simply a reminder of the previous day's trials. She arranged her shawl, also dry now, and prepared to face the midpoint of the week. In the breakfast room, the household spirits had lifted noticeably. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the table with cheerful brightness. Mrs. Thornby moved about with renewed energy, her usual warmth restored after Tuesday's weather-induced subdual. Even Mr. Greaves looked less severe, his newspaper examination producing occasional nods rather than constant frowns. The morning porridge arrived with a pat of butter melting on its surface, an indulgence Mrs. Thornby sometimes allowed when spirits needed lifting. Beatrice stirred the butter through the grain, creating swirls of richness that made the simple food particularly satisfying. Toast followed, crisp and golden, accompanied by marmalade that caught the sunlight in its amber depths. Miss Pemberton discussed practical matters related to her upcoming position. She would need to purchase certain items of clothing appropriate for a Belgravia household, and wondered about shops where such things might be found affordably. Mrs. Thornby offered suggestions, her knowledge of London's commerce proving useful. The conversation felt purposeful and optimistic, very different from the previous evening's quiet acknowledgement of coming change. After breakfast, Beatrice stepped into the transformed street. The air held an autumn crispness that made walking a pleasure. People moved with renewed energy, their faces no longer set in expressions of grim endurance. Shop windows gleamed, their glass cleaned by rain and now reflecting the morning brightness. The route to the solicitor's firm revealed details obscured by yesterday's rain. Beatrice noticed a new display in the baker's window, loaves arranged in a pattern that formed a kind of edible sculpture. The milliner's shop showed bonnets trimmed with ribbons in autumn colors, deep gold, russet brown, wine red. A cat sat in a sunny doorway, washing its face with methodical attention. Beatrice, 26 years old, walked with her usual measured pace, but today the journey felt less like obligation and more like simple movement through a world made interesting by cleared weather. Her ink-stained fingers held her satchel without strain. The week's midpoint had arrived, which meant the downward slope toward rest had begun. At the firm, her workroom welcomed her with its familiar arrangement. Today's stack of documents appeared less daunting than usual, or perhaps the sunshine streaming through her window simply made everything seem more manageable. She arranged her materials and began the day's copying with a sense of steady purpose. The morning's work involved transcribing a will for an elderly gentleman in Kensington. The document was lengthy but straightforward, disposing of property and possessions with methodical clarity. As she copied each bequest, a house to one daughter, investments to a son, specific pieces of furniture to various grandchildren, she found herself contemplating the way lives accumulated things and how those things outlasted their owners, passing into new hands to serve new purposes. The work proceeded smoothly. Her pen moved across the page with confident strokes, each letter formed precisely. The sunshine moved across her desk as morning advanced, creating a slowly shifting pattern of light and shadow that marked time's passage more pleasantly than any clock. By midday, she had completed the will and moved on to correspondence. The letters today concerned routine matters, acknowledgments of payments received, confirmations of appointments, brief responses to minor inquiries. Nothing required particular concentration, allowing her mind to drift occasionally while her hands continued their accustomed labor. Her lunch consisted of bread with sliced ham and a small apple that proved surprisingly sweet despite its unremarkable appearance. She ate at her desk, looking out the window at the courtyard where pigeons had returned in greater numbers, emboldened by the improved weather. Their movements held a purposefulness she found oddly pleasing. Each bird seemed to know exactly what it sought, even if that purpose remained mysterious to her observation. The afternoon brought a different kind of work. One of the junior partners had drafted a contract requiring review and fair copying. The original showed numerous crossings out and insertions, the document having gone through multiple revisions. Beatrice's task was to produce a clean version, incorporating all changes while maintaining perfect legibility. This work required closer attention than simple transcription. She had to interpret the junior partner's sometimes unclear handwriting, follow the logic of insertions marked with arrows and asterisks, ensure that the final product read smoothly despite its cobbled-together origins. The challenge engaged her fully, making the afternoon hours pass with surprising speed. When she finally set down her pen, the completed contract lay before her in pristine form. No hint of the messy drafting process visible, only clear, precise legal language that would bind parties to their agreements. There was particular satisfaction in this transformation, turning chaos into order through patient attention. The church bells marked 4 o'clock just as she finished organizing her desk for the next day. The timing felt auspicious, as if the day itself acknowledged her completed work. She gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, noting how the afternoon sunlight had taken on a warmer, more golden quality. Outside, the street showed its late afternoon character. The business day was concluding for many, workers emerging from doorways to begin their homeward journeys. The air had cooled noticeably as the sun descended, but it remained pleasant, fresh rather than cold. Beatrice walked among the crowd, neither hurrying nor dawdling, simply moving at her natural pace. The route home took her past a small park she rarely noticed. Today, drawn by the pleasant weather, she detoured slightly to walk along its border. A few benches held occupants enjoying the improved conditions, an elderly man feeding pigeons, two women engaged in animated conversation, a young mother watching a child toddle across the grass. The sight of others at leisure in the middle of a weekday stirred something in Beatrice, not quite envy, more a kind of wistfulness. Her life allowed little spontaneity, little time for simply sitting in sunshine or watching children play. Yet she had chosen this path, trading such freedoms for security and independence. The exchange seemed fair most days, though moments like this revealed what had been given up. She continued toward the boarding house, leaving the park behind. The brief detour had added perhaps 10 minutes to her journey, a small indulgence that felt both pleasant and vaguely transgressive, as if even this minor deviation from routine required justification. At the boarding house, preparations for supper were underway. The scent of baking filled the hallway. Mrs. Thornby had made a cottage pie, its crust browning in the oven. Beatrice climbed to her room and removed her shawl, then stood at the window for a moment, watching the street below as it transitioned into evening. The lengthening shadows held a particular quality at this time of year, a suggestion of seasons turning, of summer's definitive end and autumn's firm establishment. Soon the days would grow noticeably shorter, darkness arriving earlier each evening. Winter would follow, bringing cold that required fires and extra blankets, streets made treacherous by ice and snow. But tonight, such thoughts held no distress. The seasons turned as they always had, bringing their changes in reliable succession. She would adapt as she always did, adding layers of clothing, requesting extra coal for her small fireplace, finding warmth where it could be found. Supper brought the household together in good spirits. The cottage pie emerged from the oven golden and bubbling, its filling rich with meat and vegetables. Mrs. Thornby served generous portions, clearly pleased with her creation. Bread accompanied the meal, an ale that Mr. Greaves had provided from a particularly good barrel at his local public house. Conversation flowed easily around the table. Miss Pemberton had completed her shopping, finding appropriate clothing at reasonable prices. Young Mr. Walsh entertained them with a story about confusion at the exchange, involving misdelivered documents and much frustrated searching. Even quiet Mrs. Thornby shared observations about the neighborhood, mentioning that the baker's daughter had recently married. After supper, Beatrice returned to her room as twilight deepened. She lit her candle and settled with the Scottish book, opening to a chapter describing the author's final days in the Highlands before returning to Edinburgh. The writing conveyed both satisfaction at the journey completed and a certain melancholy at leaving landscapes that had come to feel like home. She read until her eyes grew heavy, then marked her place and prepared for bed. The nightdress felt soft against her skin, and the room held a comfortable temperature, cool but not cold, requiring the quilt's warmth but not multiple blankets. She brushed her chestnut hair with steady strokes, counting in her mind, the rhythm soothing. Beneath the worn quilt, she reflected on Wednesday's particular character. The week's midpoint always carried a sense of balance, equal distance from Monday's beginning and Sunday's rest, poised between effort expended and effort still required. Tomorrow would tip the scales toward conclusion, Friday would accelerate the descent, and then weekend reprieve would arrive once more. The church bells rang 10 times, their sound clear in the quiet evening. She counted them silently, marking another hour, another day nearly complete. Sleep approached with familiar gentleness, bringing no drama, simply the reliable transition from waking to rest. Beatrice, 26 years old, lay with her ink-stained fingers relaxed on the quilt. Tomorrow would bring more copying work, more walks through familiar streets, more meals at the boarding house table. The pattern continued, reliable and unchanging, carrying her forward through time one day at a time. Her breathing deepened and slowed. The candle burned low, its flame steady in the still air. Outside, Wednesday night settled over London. Shops closing, families gathering, the city's vast mechanism shifting into its nocturnal rhythms. And in this small room, sleep arrived fully, carrying Beatrice down into its peaceful depths, where documents and ink and gray wool dresses dissolved into formless rest. The deep unconsciousness that restored and renewed, preparing her for Thursday and Friday, and all the days beyond. The endless succession of mornings and evenings that comprised a life lived with quiet dignity and patient attention to duty. The worn quilt rose and fell. The room held its warmth in silence. The city breathed on through the darkness. And all was peaceful, all was well, all was exactly as it should be in this moment, this particular Wednesday night in autumn in London, in the year 1873. The days that followed settled into their natural rhythm, each one distinct yet somehow part of the same continuous flow. Thursday brought more documents to copy, Friday its half-day reprieve. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, and Beatrice walked to the firm knowing that only a few hours of work stood between her and Sunday's rest. The week's final documents concerned a property sale in Mayfair. Her pen moved across the pages with practiced ease, forming the final words of the week's labor. When she finished, she cleaned her pen with particular care, knowing it would rest unused until Monday. The ritual of putting her workspace in order felt especially satisfying today, each item positioned precisely for the week ahead. Walking home through the midday brightness, she noticed how the season had advanced even in these few days. More leaves had turned golden, and the air carried a sharper edge that spoke of winter's eventual arrival. But today, the sun warmed her shoulders, and the walk felt pleasant rather than merely necessary. Sunday arrived with church bells and the luxury of slow waking. Beatrice lay beneath the worn quilt, listening to the city's quieter rhythms, feeling gratitude for this weekly respite. When she finally rose, she dressed in her blue wool dress and spent the morning reading in her room, the Scottish book open in her lap. The author's journey had concluded, the walker returning to ordinary life after weeks in wild places. The final pages describe the strange adjustment to city streets after so much time among mountains and glens, how buildings felt confining, how pavement seemed artificial beneath feet that had grown accustomed to earth and stone. Yet beneath this adjustment lay contentment, the knowledge that both worlds had their place, that returning home did not diminish what had been experienced in leaving. Beatrice closed the book and set it aside, gazing out her window at the Sunday street below. A few people walked past in their best clothes, moving without haste toward whatever occupied their afternoon. The boarding house lay quiet around her, each resident engaged in their own private observances of rest. She thought about Miss Pemberton, who would leave tomorrow for her new position in Belgravia. The household would shift to accommodate this absence, and eventually a new resident would arrive to fill the empty room. The pattern would continue, people entering and leaving, but the essential rhythm remaining unchanged. Her own life would proceed in its established manner. Work at the firm 5.5 days weekly, walks through familiar streets, meals at the boarding house table, evenings spent reading or simply sitting by her window. The years would pass in this way, each day building upon the last, creating a life defined not by dramatic events but by quiet consistency. There was peace in this recognition. She had found her place in the vast machinery of London, a small role but a necessary one. Her copying work mattered, maintaining the legal records that bound people to their agreements. Her rent supported Mrs. Thornby's household. Her presence added to the fabric of the boarding house community. These were modest contributions, but they were real. As afternoon faded toward evening, she remained at her window, watching light change across the rooftops. The sun descended slowly, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Chimney smoke rose straight into the still air, marking each dwelling with its vertical line. The church bells rang for evensong, their voices layered and harmonious. She listened until the last note faded, then continued sitting in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Thornby would call for supper soon, the promised roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, a meal that would mark the week's conclusion and the cycle's continuation. But for now, there was only this moment of stillness, the worn quilt on her bed, freshly smoothed, the small fireplace, its grate clean and ready for winter's eventual fires, the desk where she sat each evening, reading or writing letters to family in the countryside. These simple furnishings comprised her world, and they were enough. Outside, the last daylight withdrew from the street. Lamps were lit in windows across the way, creating constellations of warm light against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a voice called and another answered. The city prepared for night, its inhabitants moving through their evening rituals, each person in their own small space, together yet separate, united by the simple fact of shared existence. Beatrice, 26 years old, sat at her window with her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders and her ink-stained fingers resting quietly in her lap. Tomorrow would bring Monday's return to work, but tonight belonged to this peaceful conclusion. The week had passed, bringing nothing remarkable yet everything necessary. Labor completed, wages earned, life sustained. The sky deepened from rose to violet to deepest blue. Stars began to appear, faint at first but growing brighter as darkness filled the spaces between buildings. She watched them emerge, these ancient lights that had shone over London for centuries, that would continue shining long after she and everyone she knew had passed from the world. The thought brought neither melancholy nor comfort, simply acceptance. This was the nature of existence, individual lives flickering briefly while the larger patterns continued unchanged. She played her small part with as much care and attention as she could muster, and that was all anyone could reasonably do. Mrs. Thornby's voice drifted up from below, calling the household to supper. Beatrice rose from her chair and descended the stairs, joining the others at the familiar table. The roast beef was tender and rich, the Yorkshire pudding risen and golden. Conversation flowed gently, touching on the week past and the week ahead, on Miss Pemberton's departure and ordinary matters of household life. After supper, she returned to her room one final time. The candle was lit, the nightdress put on, the hair brushed with its 100 strokes. She slipped beneath the worn quilt and felt her body settle into the familiar contours of the mattress. The church bells rang for 10 o'clock, their sound rolling across the rooftops and chimneys of London. She counted them silently. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, marking the hour, marking the moment, marking the endless succession of moments that comprised a life. Sleep approached with its usual gentleness. Her breathing slowed and deepened. The room held its warmth and quiet. Outside, the city continued its breathing, carriages rolling over cobblestones, voices calling in distant streets, the soft settling of buildings into night. And in this small room on the 3rd floor of Mrs. Thornby's boarding house, Beatrice descended into sleep, her chestnut hair spread across the pillow, her ink-stained fingers relaxed and still, her body at rest after the week's labors. Around her, the boarding house held its sleeping occupants, each person dreaming their own dreams, each following their own patterns of rest and waking. The worn quilt rose and fell with each breath. The candle flame flickered once, twice, then steadied. Shadows lay gentle across the walls and ceiling. The street below had grown quiet, only occasional footsteps breaking the stillness. All was peaceful, all was well, all was exactly, precisely as it should be. This particular Sunday night, in this particular room, in this particular life unfolding with quiet grace and patient acceptance. Day following day, week following week. The seasons turning, the years passing. The great wheel of existence carrying everything forward in its appointed manner, bringing work and rest, effort and ease. The simple, enduring rhythm of days lived with dignity and care, beneath London's eternal sky. The morning that followed arrived with a gentleness that seemed to honor the peaceful conclusion of the previous night. Beatrice woke gradually, her body rising toward consciousness without urgency or distress. Pale November light filtered through her window, softer than summer's brightness, but no less beautiful in its muted way. She lay still for several moments, aware of the comfort of her bed, the weight of the worn quilt, the quiet sounds of the boarding house beginning its Monday routines. Mrs. Thornby's voice drifted up from below, speaking to the housemaid in tones too low to distinguish words but clear enough to convey their familiar rhythm. When she finally rose, The floorboards felt cool beneath her feet, but not uncomfortably so. She moved to the washstand and poured water, watching it catch the morning light as it fell. The ritual of washing, of working her chestnut hair into its accustomed arrangement, of fastening the buttons of her gray wool dress, all these small acts carried the weight of countless repetitions, each one contributing to the larger pattern of her days. Downstairs, breakfast awaited with its reliable offerings. Porridge steamed in its bowl, toast stood ready on its plate, tea filled the pot with its dark warmth. Miss Pemberton's chair sat empty. She had departed early that morning for Belgravia, beginning her new position. The absence registered but did not disturb the meal's essential character. Mr. Greaves read his newspaper with customary attention. Young Mr. Walsh ate his breakfast with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Thornby moved between table and kitchen, ensuring everyone had what they needed. The conversation remained subdued. Mondays returned to routine, requiring adjustment after Sunday's rest. After breakfast, Beatrice gathered her belongings and stepped into the November morning. The street had returned to its weekday character, purposeful movement, faces set toward destinations, the great mechanism of commerce and labor resuming its operations. She joined this flow, her feet finding their familiar path without conscious direction. The walk to the solicitor's firm unfolded as it always did, each landmark passing in its expected sequence. The baker arranging his window display, the milliner adjusting her bonnets, the corner where she always paused for traffic, the intersection where morning light struck the buildings at a particular angle. At the firm, her workroom welcomed her with its patient emptiness. The desk waited, clean and organized from Friday's careful preparation. The chair stood ready to receive her. The window framed its view of the courtyard, where pigeons moved across the stones in their eternal search for sustenance. She arranged her materials, paper, ink, pen, blotting, sand, each item placed with mindful precision. The first document of the week lay atop the stack, a contract requiring transcription. She drew it toward her, read the opening lines, then set pen to paper and began. The scratch of nib against page filled the quiet room. Letters formed into words, words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs. The morning advanced around her labor, marked by shifting light and distant bells, by the gradual warming of air and the slow accumulation of completed pages. Her hand moved with the confidence of long practice. Her mind held both focus and ease, attending to accuracy while allowing deeper thoughts to drift beneath the surface of consciousness. This was her work, this transformation of words from one page to another, this preservation of agreements and intentions in permanent form. Hours dissolved into the rhythm of labor. The stack of finished documents grew while the stack of unfinished ones diminished. Morning became afternoon, and afternoon would become evening, and evening would fold into night, and night would give way to another morning. The pattern continued, reliable as breath, constant as the turning of the earth. Beatrice, 26 years old, sat at her desk with her ink-stained fingers holding the pen, her chestnut hair gathered in its practical knot, her gray wool dress absorbing the workroom's quiet light. Beyond her window, the city proceeded through its day. thousands upon thousands of people, each engaged in their own labors, each contributing their small part to the vast, intricate system that sustained them all. She paused in her copying to flex her hand, observing the familiar ache that came from sustained effort. Outside, a pigeon landed on the courtyard stones, pecked once, twice, then flew away. Clouds moved slowly across the sky, their shadows passing over buildings and streets. Time flowed forward in its inexorable manner, carrying everything along, people and pigeons, clouds and buildings, ink-stained fingers and worn quilts, morning light and evening darkness. She dipped her pen and continued writing. The words formed themselves beneath her hand, each one placed with care, each one taking its position in the larger document. This was enough. This steady attention to the task before her, this reliable execution of familiar duties, this quiet participation in the ongoing life of the city. The afternoon light shifted across her desk, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the still air. The church bells rang 3 times, their sound rolling across rooftops. Her breathing remained steady and even. The pen moved forward, line by line, creating order from intention, transforming thought into permanent record. And so the day proceeded, and so it would continue, this day and the next and all the days beyond, each one bringing its own small variations within the larger pattern, each one contributing to a life lived with patience and purpose and quiet dignity. The work continued. The city breathed. The hours passed. And in a small room in a solicitor's firm in London, Beatrice sat copying documents, her presence unremarkable yet essential, her labor unnoticed yet necessary, her life unfolding exactly as it was meant to, peaceful and purposeful and complete. The weeks that followed carried Beatrice deeper into autumn's embrace. The new resident arrived to take Miss Pemberton's room, a seamstress named Eleanor, 30 years old, with careful hands and a quiet manner that fit easily into the boarding house rhythms. The household adjusted to her presence as it had adjusted to all changes, finding its new balance without disruption. November brought colder mornings and earlier darkness. Beatrice woke now to rooms chilled by night air, the washstand water so cold it made her gasp. Mrs. Thornby began lighting fires in the common areas, and the scent of coal smoke became a constant presence, marking the season's progression as surely as any calendar. The work at the solicitor's firm continued its steady flow. Documents arrived, were copied, were filed away into the permanent record. Her ink-stained fingers grew more sensitive to the cold, requiring her to pause occasionally to warm them before resuming. The solicitors discussed allowing small fires in individual workrooms, but such decisions required approval from the senior partners and moved through the firm's hierarchy with glacial slowness. One particularly cold morning in late November, Beatrice arrived at her workroom to find a small parcel on her desk. Inside lay a pair of fingerless gloves, knitted in soft gray wool. A note in Mrs. Thornby's handwriting explained simply, "For your hands while you work. The cold makes everything harder." She slipped them on, feeling immediate warmth spread through her palms and wrists while leaving her fingers free for writing. The gesture touched something deep within her, this practical kindness, this attention to small discomforts, this recognition of her daily struggles. She sat for a moment before beginning work, simply appreciating the gift and what it represented. The copying that day proceeded with unusual ease, her warmed hands moving smoothly across the pages. She completed more work than usual, the gloves making all the difference between discomfort that distracted and comfort that allowed full focus. That evening at supper, she thanked Mrs. Thornby, who waved away the gratitude with characteristic modesty, though pleasure showed clearly in her expression. December arrived with its own particular character. The streets filled with preparations for Christmas, shop windows displaying special goods, vendors selling evergreen boughs and holly, the general atmosphere taking on a quality both festive and somehow melancholy. The year was ending, time marked not just in days but in seasons completed, cycles fulfilled. On the shortest day of the year, Beatrice finished her work early and walked home through afternoon darkness that felt premature and strange. Street lamps were already lit, creating islands of illumination in the early evening. She passed families shopping together, children pressing their faces against shop windows, their breath fogging the glass as they gazed at displayed treasures. Something about the scene stirred memories of her own childhood, winters in the countryside, the village church decorated with evergreens, her mother preparing special meals despite their modest means. Those years felt simultaneously distant and immediate, separated by time yet somehow still present in the cold air and the scent of pine boughs. At the boarding house, Mrs. Thornby had begun her own Christmas preparations. A small fir tree stood in the corner of the common room, its branches waiting to be decorated. The scent filled the space with freshness that contrasted pleasantly with the usual coal smoke. That evening after supper, the household gathered to trim the tree with simple ornaments, paper chains that Alina the seamstress had fashioned, a few glass baubles Mrs. Thornby had saved for years, candles that would be lit on Christmas Eve. Beatrice contributed ribbons purchased from a market stall, their red silk bright against the dark green branches. As she tied them carefully to the boughs, she felt herself part of something larger than her individual existence. This household creating its own small celebration. These people who were not family but who shared daily life, creating moments of collective joy. Christmas Day itself arrived with clear, cold weather. The boarding house observed the holiday with special breakfast, eggs and bacon, fresh bread with butter and jam, tea served in the better cups. Mr. Greaves had purchased oranges for everyone, a luxury that brought genuine delight. Beatrice peeled hers slowly, savoring both the fruit and the gesture behind the gift. The day unfolded without work obligations, hours given entirely to rest and modest celebration. A roasted goose appeared at dinner, accompanied by potatoes and winter vegetables, followed by a plum pudding that Mrs. Thornby had been preparing for weeks. The meal stretched long, conversation flowing easily, laughter coming more readily than usual. In the evening, they gathered in the common room around the decorated tree. Mrs. Thornby lit the candles carefully, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Someone, young Mr. Walsh perhaps, began singing a carol, and others joined in, voices blending in imperfect but earnest harmony. Beatrice sang quietly, her voice barely audible beneath the others. The candlelight warmed the room, or perhaps the warmth came from the gathered people themselves, their combined presence creating something more than the sum of individual lives. For this moment, loneliness seemed impossible, isolation unthinkable. They were together, and that togetherness mattered. As the year drew toward its close, Beatrice found herself reflecting on the months that had passed. Nothing extraordinary had occurred, no dramatic changes, no significant events. She had worked, walked, eaten, slept, and worked again, day after day, week after week. Miss Pemberton had departed and a leaner had arrived. The seasons had turned from spring through summer and autumn into winter. Yet these small, unremarkable days had accumulated into something substantial. She had earned her keep, maintained her independence, contributed her labor to the city's great enterprise. She had participated in the boarding house community, offering and receiving small kindnesses. She had lived in all the modest, ordinary ways that constituted a life. On the final evening of the year, she sat at her window watching the street below. People hurried past, many heading toward public houses or gatherings where they would mark midnight's arrival with celebration. The boarding house would observe more quietly. Mrs. Thornby planned tea and cake at 11:30, allowing them to welcome the new year together before retiring. Beatrice, 26 years old, gazed out at the December darkness and felt a curious mixture of contentment and wistfulness. Another year would begin tomorrow, bringing more days of copying documents, more walks through familiar streets, more evenings in this small room. The pattern would continue, varied only in details so minor they barely registered. Yet this continuity itself held value. In a world of constant change and uncertainty, she had created stability. In a city of millions, she had found her small place. The life she lived might lack drama or distinction, but it was hers, earned through her own efforts, shaped by her own choices. The church bells began to ring, marking the final hour of the year. She counted them, 1 through 12, then heard them continue, ringing on in celebration as midnight arrived. From the street below came shouts and laughter, people calling out greetings and good wishes. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Thornby's voice summoned everyone downstairs. She rose from her chair and descended to join the others. They gathered in the common room, raising cups of tea in simple toast to the year ahead. Mr. Greaves offered wishes for good health. Eleanor spoke of hopping for increased work. Young Mr. Walsh mentioned ambitions at the exchange. Mrs. Thornby simply smiled and said she hoped they would all be together again next year. When the small celebration concluded, Beatrice climbed back to her room. The street had grown quieter, the midnight revelers having dispersed to their homes. She prepared for bed with her usual care, conscious that this night stood at the boundary between years but was also simply another night, requiring the same rituals of washing and brushing and settling beneath covers. In bed, she lay listening to the boarding house settle around her. Footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the familiar creaks and sighs of the building itself. Through her window came the last distant sounds of celebration, growing fainter as the new year's first minutes passed. Sleep approached as it always did, without fanfare or resistance. Her breathing deepened. Her muscles released their final tensions. The worn quilt held its accumulated warmth. The room embraced its darkness. And Beatrice descended into sleep as one year ended and another began. Her chestnut hair spread across the pillow. Her ink-stained fingers relaxed and peaceful. Her body at rest after another day, another week, another year of quiet labor and modest contentment. Tomorrow would bring new dates to write at the tops of documents, but the essential pattern would remain unchanged. The reliable rhythm of work and rest, effort and ease, the simple, enduring cycle of days that comprised a life. The city breathed on through the darkness, its countless inhabitants each dreaming their own dreams, each following their own paths through time. In grand houses and modest rooms, in wealth and poverty, in youth and age, London slept and woke, worked and rested, lived and died, the great organism continuing its eternal respiration. And in one small room on the third floor of a boarding house in Bloomsbury, all was peaceful and still. The worn quilt rose and fell with steady breath. The darkness held its gentle watch. The new year had arrived, bringing with it all the promise and uncertainty of time yet unlived. But for now, in this moment suspended between past and future, there was only rest, deep, restorative, complete. Beatrice slept, carried through the night on currents of unconsciousness that asked nothing and gave everything, the profound stillness that renewed body and spirit alike. The candle had long since guttered out. The street lay quiet beneath winter stars. The boarding house held its sleeping occupants in patient embrace. And in this small sanctuary of rest, in this particular room, in this particular city, in this particular moment at the turn of the year, all was exactly, precisely, utterly as it should be. The hours passed in silence. Dawn would come eventually, bringing its own light and obligations. But the night remained, offering its ancient gift of darkness and dreams, carrying Beatrice and all of sleeping London through the peaceful depths toward whatever morning might bring. Work to be done, streets to be walked, documents to be copied, days to be lived with the same quiet dignity and patient grace that had brought her safely through all the days behind. The worn quilt held its warmth. The room breathed softly. Time flowed forward in its endless stream, and sleep continued its restorative work, healing what needed healing, resting what needed rest, preparing her for the life that would resume with morning's arrival, ordinary, unremarkable, and infinitely precious in its simple, steady continuation. All was well, all was peaceful, all was complete.